Hello, friends in darkness. I had a dream, which was not at all a dream. Darkness, she was. The universe. Now, speaking of English Romanticism or Romanticism more broadly, this is just Lord Byron's Darkness. I'd like to speak briefly on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And I've recently read it actually for the first time. Now, we all grew up with notions of the monster Frankenstein. Rarely stop to think that, of course, the monster isn't called Frankenstein, but it's Victor Frankenstein, the chemist who, in Ingolstadt of all places, during his studies, creates from his imagination that monster, taller than any human, 8 feet tall, etc. Not entirely hideous, but of course, as he uses human body parts and perhaps even animal body parts and organs to produce this creature, brings forth, and this is the salient point, brings forth from his imagination the monster, and he does so in a way almost, it seems, to avoid having sex, as some have suggested, which is the easiest way to produce a human being. If you didn't know, by the way, if you're looking to make a human being, whether you be female or male, there's a pretty solid way of doing it. It's been proven billions and billions of times over. But I think now to get to more serious matters, there's an essay by Paul Cantor on the nightmare of romantic idealism, in which he says the following. I think it's a very good essay if you haven't read it. And he says the following: if man creates the world through the power of his own consciousness, then man is threatened with having to exist alone in that world, or worse, to be confronted only by an externalization of his own desires that horrifies him in its hideousness. To be the sole creator of one's world seems like a glorious prospect until one realizes the consequences of seeing oneself mirrored everywhere one turns. So, in fact, what he here addresses is the following. That is to say that there's a solid, this is again Cantor, he says, there's a dangerous solipsistic tendency inherent in the romantic concept of the imagination. And I think that ultimately, by Mary Shelley, the one woman really of English Romanticism, is capable of bringing out quite to, in contrast, let's say, to her husband, Percy Shelley, who believed that who thought the poet to be the legislator of the world, who thought that man now should be able to create the world on his own terms in poetic terms. And but of course, then again, also as Hegel points out and Shelley himself says, is the world is never good enough. Once it becomes flesh, once you actually write down your poetic thought, it is already reduced in its scope and meaning and significance. It becomes if not poisoned, then at least it's tainted with finitude. Hegel, by the way, if you're interested in the introduction to his aesthetics, and I have a video on this somewhere on my channel. If you type in Hegel, Niederhauser aesthetics, then you find that. It's about a half-hour lecture where he goes into, Hegel that is, what the Romantics sort of not get wrong, but how they fail to reconcile with the world is because the world will never be good enough. And Shelley points this out, and she goes to those. So Frankenstein is not so much. It is on some level, of course, a warning against the advances of the science, etc. So you could say it's sort of a conservative impulse here. But I think on a much deeper level, which is much more important, what we can see here is a warning, really, against the imagination. And in fact, a rampant imagination, that if it is a finite imagination, the imagination of the human being, and we are finite beings, once this imagination begins to dream up a creature that is supposed to serve its creator, that's when all hell breaks loose. Now, but the imagination is not, is in a sense, is the Vorstellung, to use the German term, which is to say that we use certain data that we have available to us, and we rehash them, rareify them, and then reapply them and try and produce something from that data. So, for example, you use the human genome, and you try to produce the perfect human being from the human genome. Of course, very soon, AI will do that for us. AI will tell us, you should match with this person because the genetic makeup is perfect to produce that kind of human being, which we now have need for because we need an IQ of 90, which means that you can, you can do menial tasks in an office and you won't question very much, but you'll be a good consumer. In some sense, you could say the Gestalt is already doing this. But this is what the imagination does. Goethe, by the way, was extremely suspicious of the imagination. Why? Because the imagination adds something where there's nothing to be seen, really. So, where the imagination, the romantic imagination especially, adds something to a situation, to a certain context, where the factual, or what shows itself by itself, phenomenologically speaking, should suffice. But the imagination adds something on top of it. In a sense, you could almost say it's a super sensible, or maybe even rather hypersensible, that the imagination tries to see, which isn't there, but then pretends that it's there, that pretends that it can be seen, and uses all kinds of means, for example, scientific models that it uses, etc. It could be anything. It could be romantic. So it doesn't. It's not so restricted to romantic poetry. This could also be seen, to make this very clear what I'm trying to say, this could also be witnessed in scientific models which are not romantic at all, which are not poetic at all. So again, what Cantor says, I think, is wonderful here, is extremely frightening though, is that there's a tendency that's solipsistic in the concept of the imagination. I don't think it's only in the concept of the romantics. The imagination has to be steered. It has to be guided by reason, by the categories, as, for example, the power of the imagination is guided by the categories in Kant. Without that, it runs rampant, and the result is literally the monster of Frankenstein, which then becomes a metaphor for something that is somewhere in the twilight zone between existence and non-existence. It's real, it exists, yes, but it's not supposed to exist. It's hideous, it's strong, but its strength leads to no good, and it can't. And there's an extreme tension between the creature and his creator, or its creator rather, because the creator cannot actually reconcile what his imagination came up with once it becomes real. Because once it becomes real or actualized, it is inferior to what the imagination has dreamt up. So the imagination is confronted with what itself wanted to be actual, and then has to, in some way, cast what it sees into nothingness, its own creation, because it never lives up to this. So it's not at all the benevolent creator, as we might assume we find in Genesis. So again, if you haven't read it yet, I'd highly recommend you read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, I never know how to pronounce it in English, and also think about, I really do think about the imagination, the power of the imagination, and how it runs rampant. How it runs rampant maybe in yourself, where you dream up something of your future self, or how a certain situation is supposed to play out. And if it doesn't play out in that way, that you're frustrated with it and with yourself, that is, again, the imagination running amok. And it's solipsistic, to quote again from Cantor. So I have the Penguin edition here, which is cheap and thin and easy to get. And also, there's this essay by Paul Cantor in here, The Nightmare of Romantic Idealism, an extremely good summary. Highly recommend it. So thank you again very much for listening. If you're new here, do feel free to like and subscribe, etc. And there will be a link to my online philosophy academy on, well, philosophy courses like on Heidegger and Hegel and German idealism, Plato, Aristotle, Goethe's Faust, which would be fitting given that we were just discussing certain elements or aspects of the Faustian soul, perhaps. But I would say the following, just to mention this again. There is a moment in the second Faust by Goethe where Faust is confronted with a homunculus, an artificially created human being who has to live in vitro. So not like Frankenstein's monster, but it was completely created artificially. But it's not Dr. Faust himself who produces this homunculus, this monster, this artificial human being. It's his colleague Wagner, who is a man of the time, who is a product of the zeitgeist, who wants to follow whatever is trendy and currently important and significant, and will get him ahead in the social game. It's not Dr. Faust's product. That's very important. So I would say Frankenstein is not Faustian. So if you're interested to read Goethe's Faust with me, with my guidance, just follow the link in the description of this video and sign up for the course. Also helps us keep the lights on here, like this one here. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you. Good night.